The hour of 10 o'clock having arrived, this hearing of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee is hereby convened. I'd like to begin today by thanking Chairman Lucas and Ranking Member Lofgren for allowing both myself and Ms. Fucci to lead this full committee hearing. And I'm very excited about the topic we're going to be discussing today. This hearing focuses on a topic of great importance both to me and to this committee, which is to review the oversight and investigative efforts of the Inspectors General within each agency within the jurisdiction of our committee. The role of the OIG in these agencies is an essential one, which is to protect the American taxpayer by working to identify federal waste, fraud, and mismanagement. Inspectors General have a strong historical precedent in our nation. IGs are meant to be the watchdogs for Congress and the American taxpayer. The independent oversight capability the IG wields to expose waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement is their core responsibility. It's critical to the independence of Inspectors General that this independence is maintained. IGs are meant to be in their parent agencies, but not of their parent agencies or, frankly, of any administration. They're meant to be apolitical and set apart in order to do the hard task of publicly highlighting the flaws of their parent agencies, and I know that that is not an easy one. Helping to achieve transparency and accountability within an administration is a difficult but a very necessary role that the IG leads. Each agency has a very different mission and goal, which makes it challenging to have a single, all-encompassing metric to evaluate the effectiveness of each IG. I hope that this hearing will be an opportunity to discuss the Inspector General should be measured and where those offices currently stand. This hearing is also a chance to highlight the important work done by each of the offices here before us today. I'd particularly like to highlight the oversight work surrounding the growing threat to our cybersecurity and research integrity standards. The COVID-19 pandemic has pushed technologies forward and implemented remote capabilities far sooner than any of us had anticipated. Hearing from each of you today on the oversight efforts your agencies have taken to enhance cybersecurity standards and promote research integrity is particularly important to me. I hope that this topic can be effectively discussed as it relates to the security of passwords and protective internal practices of each of the agencies that you represent. This is likely to be a discussion for future hearings as well. I certainly hope it will be, but I encourage conversations on this topic today. Several of the agencies here today before us have received millions, if not billions, of federal dollars to advance research and development initiatives. Massive spending bills such as the Infrastructure Investments and Job Acts, CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act have recently become law and have provided agencies with new statutory mandates as well as research and development funds to advance innovation in our country. However, more spending also means more opportunities for mismanagement of those taxpayer funds, making the IG's role more important than ever. I'd like to hear how each IG has already begun to provide oversight of these taxpayer funds as well as future oversight plans in these areas. It's critical as new programs and funds are implemented that every proper measure is taken to safeguard them from fraud and abuse. This hearing also serves as an opportunity for this committee to emphasize the various findings the IGs have reported on in areas that have raised considerable concerns. Just a few issues we hope to address here include the law enforcement presence and mitigation efforts of sexual assault and harassment allegations in the Antarctic, the extent of work-from-home policies that are in place, and various award and procurement issues as we move closer to the congressional appropriations season. At this time, I would like to welcome our esteemed witnesses and thank you all for joining us. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion with each of you, and I'm hopeful our conversation today will highlight the good work being done in accountability and transparency, and hope it also strengthens your oversight and investigatory efforts. So thank you very much for being here, and I'll now recognize my ranking member, the gentlewoman from North Carolina, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Obernolte, and thank you for leading today's hearing. I'm very pleased to serve beside you this Congress as the ranking member of Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee. Science Committee oversight of federal scientific enterprise is crucial. I look forward to working with you in a bipartisan fashion to support the incredible work that scientists inside and outside of government are doing every day to confront the challenges of the 21st century and to maintain American leadership in science and innovation. I am a strong supporter of federal scientific research, and I believe the federal government is irreplaceable in its ability to deploy resources on a vast scale to fund breakthroughs in basic and applied science. But with that singular role comes a responsibility to use taxpayer dollars effectively. Through the work of their offices, the inspectors general testifying here today are helpful to uphold core principles of good government that we all share. That is why I am proud to support their work and eager to hear their perspectives on strengthening the integrity of federal scientific programs. I am proud to represent North Carolina's 4th Congressional District, which is one of the nation's leading hubs for scientific research, led by research universities such as Duke University, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and North Carolina Central University, as well as innovation centers like Research Triangle Park. My district understands the power of science to generate innovation, transform industry, and create jobs. Federal science agencies such as NSF, DOE, and EPA are important participants in this research ecosystem. North Carolina's 4th is home to the world-class EPA lab, where federal researchers at EPA's Office of Research and Development provide the scientific underpinning for crucial health protective regulations. Agencies also fund programs and initiatives at local institutions in support of a wide range of cutting-edge scientific activities, such as DOE's Triangle University's Nuclear Laboratory Center of Excellence and NSF's Research Triangle Nanotechnology Network. So I have a keen interest in ensuring that federal research programs are managed well and adhere to best practices in using the funds that are entrusted to them. The researchers in my district are some of the most brilliant people you will ever meet, and they deserve to know that the federal agencies working to support them are upholding the same rigorous standards that they apply to their own work. I also want to emphasize that support for rigorous oversight does not in any way signal a lack of support for investing in federal research at the levels we need to maintain American preeminence in science and technology. Indeed, the two priorities go hand in hand. The last Congress made critical investments in federal science through landmark legislation like the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. These investments are a pillar of America's future, and I am committed to making sure that they endure. Careful oversight by Congress, OIGs, and others will help maximize their impact, because when it comes to federal research funding, good government is good policy. I am grateful to the witnesses for testifying here today and for the work that you do. Once again, Chairman Obernolte, it is my great hope that through our oversight efforts this Congress, we can find common ground in support of American science. I believe we can, and I will work with you to do so. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fucci. I completely agree with you, and I think we will find that common ground. Chairman Lucas's opening statement will be submitted for the record. At this time, I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Congresswoman Lofgren, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Chairman Lucas, Chairman Obernolte for holding this hearing today. I'm a big fan of the Inspector General concept. You do good work helping us to find issues that need improvement. And given the large investments that we made in science in the last Congress, it's important we take a look at how those programs are being administered. The investments in federal science agencies are going to bring about new discoveries on the shoulders of impressive accomplishments in the past. I'll just note that the Department of Energy will continue leading us into a clean energy future, building upon the incredible breakthroughs in fusion energy that we saw at the in the last year and frankly the last years. As I said, the inspector generals play an important role. We've provided additional funding because with your additional responsibilities will come additional work. Some challenges may be difficult because some of these agencies may be standing up completely new endeavors. It won't be the same old, and I'm confident that the IGs will take that responsibility and that new challenge seriously and be successful. Now, the fact that I support rigorous oversight does not mean that I am suspicious or unhappy about the investments that we made in the last Congress. It's important that we did that, and we did it on a bipartisan basis. But investments made in the CHIPS and Science program in particular we need oversight. We need oversight to make sure that those substantial investments are making the best possible use of taxpayer dollars. I know that we will do this on a bipartisan basis, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here, as well as thanking our bipartisan science group for once again working together for science advancement. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Lofgren. We will now move to our witness panel. All of our witnesses here today are extremely accomplished and have participated in government oversight for years, so welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for being part of our panel today. Our first witness today is Mr. Paul Martin, who is the current Inspector General for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Mr. Martin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Obernolte and Ranking Members Fushi and Lofgren and committee members. While undoubtedly innovative and inspirational, NASA faces long-standing challenges with its contracting and project management that have led to substantial cost and schedule growth in many of its programs. This morning, I plan to highlight 3 challenges that NASA must address to achieve its ambitious aeronautics, science, and space exploration goals. The first, developing comprehensive and accurate cost and schedule estimates. NASA has struggled for years to develop reliable life cycle estimates for many of its multi-billion-dollar programs, including Artemis and the James Webb Space Telescope. For Artemis, NASA lacks a comprehensive cost estimate that accounts for all program costs, an omission that contributes to a lack of transparency into the funding required to sustain the program. Through our audit work, the OIG developed just such an estimate, and we project that NASA will spend $93 billion on Artemis from 2012 through 2025. In addition, we reported a cost of $4.1 billion per launch for at least the first 4 Artemis missions, an expense we found unsustainable. NASA must accelerate its efforts to make its Artemis-related programs more affordable. Otherwise, relying on such an expensive single-use rocket system will inhibit NASA's ability to sustain its exploration goals for the Moon and Mars. The second challenge, project management. Our oversight work over the years has identified multiple examples of project management deficiencies. Specifically, our June 2022 report on development of Mobile Launcher 2, the ground structure required to launch larger variants of the SLS Orion system, found that NASA is likely to spend over $1 billion on ML2, or more than 2.5 times more than initially planned, with final delivery at least 2.5 years late. We determined that the project's substantial cost increases and schedule delays are attributable primarily to the poor performance of Bechtel, the project's contractor. However, NASA's management practices also contributed to cost increases and schedule delays. And challenge 3, choice of contracting vehicles and use of award fees. NASA has struggled over the years to make the most appropriate contracting decisions with its programs. Development contracts such as those for the SLS core stages, boosters, and engines, and the Orion capsule were sole sourced, eliminating the potential benefits of competition. and competitive follow-on awards for the production contracts for these programs proved infeasible. Moreover, NASA has a history of paying overly generous award fees to contractors, fees that are often inconsistent with the quality of their performance. For example, in October 2018, we reported that issues driven mostly by Boeing's poor performance resulted in a 2.5-year schedule slip and $4 billion in cost increases for development of 2 SLS core stages. However, between 2012 and 2017, NASA paid Boeing $323 million in award, milestone, and incentive fees, of which we questioned nearly $64 million. We had similar concerns with Lockheed's performance developing Orion. In July 2020, we reported that Lockheed received nearly all available award fees over a 9-year period, even though the program was experiencing $900 million in cost increases and schedule delays of more than 3 years. We calculated that NASA paid Lockheed at least $27.8 million in excess award fees. To its credit, NASA is taking steps to improve management of its major programs. For example, the agency has decreased the use of award fee contracts from 42% in 2020 to 28% just 2 years later. In addition, NASA is exploring ways to make its lunar mission sustainable by transitioning several programs to fixed-price contracts and increasingly utilizing public-private partnerships. We look forward to sharing the results of our oversight work with this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. Our second witness today is Ms. Allison Lerner, who is the current Inspector General for the National Science Foundation. Ms. Lerner, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Get the microphone, please.
There we go. Chairman Obernolte, Ranking Member Fushi, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the National Science Foundation Office of Inspector General's efforts to combat fraud, waste, and mismanagement. My testimony today will focus on 3 key areas: our oversight, addressing the strength and integrity of NSF programs and internal controls, our efforts to hold people accountable for wrongdoing and to use insights from our investigations to strengthen internal controls, and our collaborative approaches to ensure stewardship of NSF funds and prevent wrongdoing. On the first point, we use a robust risk assessment process to focus our work on programs and institutions that appear to be at highest risk, and we use flexible audit contracts and approaches to ensure maximum impact of our limited audit resources. We also seek ways to amplify the impact of our audits, including our recent report on promising practices from our external audits, which shares ways for all members of the NSF recipient community, not just those we audit, to improve their stewardship of federal funds. Recent examples of our work include our report summarizing key issues from our audits of recipients of the established program to stimulate competitive research, which is helping NSF build the award management capacity and capability of institutions that have historically received limited federal research funds, and our recent summary of federal OIG findings and recommendations relating to other transaction agreements, which identified risks inherent to OTAs for NSF to consider as it develops OTA policies and procedures for the new Technology, Innovation, and Partnership Directorate. Moving to the second point, we use our in-depth experience fighting grant fraud to protect NSF funds and to hold wrongdoers accountable. We use multidisciplinary investigative teams to enhance the thoroughness and success of our cases, and we pursue criminal, civil, and administrative remedies, including government-wide suspensions and debarments, to hold individuals who misuse NSF funds to account. We also provide insights based on our cases to NSF so it can tighten controls to prevent fraud in the future. Because awardees who misuse NSF funds are often misusing research funding from other federal agencies, we lead 2 cross-government working groups focused on research security-related grant fraud and fraud in the small business innovation research and small business technology transfer programs to strengthen the whole of government's ability to hold individuals who misuse research funds accountable. Finally, we use collaborative approaches to ensure the effective stewardship of NSF funds and prevent and address wrongdoing. Such actions include our robust outreach program, which helps NSF recipients identify ways to prevent fraud and improve their award management environments, and our deeply collaborative working relationship with NSF's Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy, with whom we work to confront research security-related challenges. As I close, I'd like to highlight 2 legislative initiatives that could strengthen our ability to hold individuals who misuse NSF funds accountable. The first reforms the Program Fraud Civil Remedies Act to make it a stronger tool to recover fraudulent expenditures and deter individuals from committing small-dollar fraud. And the second would protect federal funds by creating a mandatory statutory exclusion for those convicted of violating certain felony fraud statutes, ensuring that they don't have access to government funds for the period of that exclusion. My office will continue to use all our audit and investigative resources to protect taxpayer funds and safeguard the integrity of NSF's operations and its investments in science. We look forward to working with NSF management, the National Science Board, and Congress to achieve this goal. This concludes my statement, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lerner. Our third witness will be Ms. Terry Donaldson, who is currently the Inspector General for the Department of Energy. Ms. Donaldson, you are recognized for 5 minutes. The microphone, please.
Good morning, Chairman Obernolte, Ranking Member Fucci. Thank you for having me here today. I'd like to begin my comments by talking about some of the huge risk factors associated with the newer funds moving to the Department of Energy, which the ranking member alluded to earlier. So just by way of context, in fiscal year 22, the Department of Energy's annual budget was $44.3 billion. When you combine the funds authorized or appropriated under IIJA, IRA, the CHIPS Act, and $1 billion to support solar projects in Puerto Rico, that number goes from 44.3 to $478 billion now within the portfolio of the Department of Energy. These are historic and unprecedented numbers. I'd also point out to the committee that the money is moving quickly. So we already have $62 billion that is on the move. It is either out the door or the subject of funding opportunities and moving out the door. So where you have a huge amount of money that is moving quickly, there are immediately new risks. Associated with these statutes, we have 71 brand new programs. By definition, brand new programs are utilizing untested internal controls, creates enormous risk. Over half of these funds will move to state, local governments, and tribes. It is not yet clear whether those entities are ready to receive funds in these unprecedented volumes. So a couple of other things to point out about the Department of Energy is even prior to these 3 bills, the Department of Energy was the leanest federal agency on the block, with over 90% of its dollars moving through to its contractors. So something of a pass-through agency. So I noted when I took over this job a little over 4 years ago, the volume of reports all concluding that the Department of Energy lacked appropriate resources for oversight. And essentially all of those included the department acknowledging that it lacked appropriate resources for oversight. So it is against that landscape that all of this new money is now going to be distributed. The Department of Energy received in the IIJA a cap for most of the IIJA programs of only 3% for oversight, a little more flexibility in IRA, which is positive. But I would point out that those oversight numbers are largely utilized to move the money out the door because they're classified as administrative expenses, most of which are to help the programs get money out the door. Only a small percentage will actually be for oversight, which is making sure that the funds landed where Congress intended them to land. So the department is arguably under-resourced for oversight, even in connection with the new funds. My shop is dramatically under-resourced to conduct oversight. So, and there's details in my written testimony, but when I came on board, my shop was already trailing the other CFO Act agencies, under-resourced historically. All of these new funds came along, and now my shop is so dramatically under-resourced that I feel compelled to mention this anytime that I'm on the Hill. So my shop received 0 additional funding in connection with the CHIPS Act, 0 additional funding in connection with the $1 billion for Puerto Rico, and we received only small numbers in connection with IIJA and IRA. So it's all detailed in my testimony, but it's something that will make it very difficult for us to conduct the audits, inspections, and investigations that are going to be so needed as we turn the corner into spending these massive amounts of money. I always say that all of the coordination and planning in the world, and we are doing a lot of that right now. We've had over 27 meetings with the department since IIJA passed, but all of the coordinating and the planning in the world is not a substitute for people. You have to have the money to conduct oversight. So that's probably my most important theme of the day. The Department of Energy is also behind in the world of data analytics. Congress has been expressing its interest in that area since 2017. The General Accounting Office has made specific recommendations to the Department of Energy that it be implementing data analytics, acquiring transaction-level detail. It has not yet done that. And that's unfortunate because now we have these big amounts of money that will be moving through, and data analytics is still only in its earliest stages at the Department of Energy. And that concludes my comments. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Donaldson. Our fourth witness this morning will be Eric Soskin, who is the current Inspector General for the Department of Transportation. Mr. Soskin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Obernolte, Ranking Member Foushee, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify on preventing waste, fraud, and mismanagement at the Department of Transportation. I'm pleased to be joining IG's Martin, Lerner, Donaldson, and O'Donnell today to discuss how our work helps safeguard taxpayer dollars while improving the efficiency and effectiveness of government programs. In our oversight activities, we routinely collaborate with partners across the federal government, including with the other OIGs represented here today, as well as with the Department of Justice. For fiscal year 2022, DOT's budget authority included approximately $355 billion to fund programs and operations through grants, contracts, and other means, including just a small portion, about $1.5 billion, dedicated to research and development. Congress has also authorized $660 billion for DOT through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, EJA, along with $106 billion in COVID-19 relief funding. As such, as IG Donaldson was referencing, the department now manages and must oversee much higher fund totals than ever before. This, in turn, increases the risk of fraud and mismanagement. To help prevent the loss of federal dollars, our office investigates allegations of fraud, waste, and abuse affecting DOT programs, contractors, grantees, and regulated entities. In fiscal year 2022, procurement and grant fraud investigations represented about 36% of our caseload. High-risk categories of fraud included bribery and corruption, overcharges for labor and materials, fraud related to disadvantaged business enterprises, or DBEs, and bid rigging. For example, as an outcome of a recent investigation by our office, a North Carolina engineering firm was sentenced to $8.5 million in fines and restitution. The firm was convicted of rigging bids related to DOT-funded projects that facilitate drainage around highways, roads, bridges, and overpasses. Strong internal controls and oversight are what's required to prevent such fraud, including effective procedures to identify and assess risks. In response to the Fraud Reduction and Data Analytics Act of 2015, DOT developed a fraud risk management implementation plan. This plan formalized the structure of DOT's fraud risk management processes and included fraud in the department's assessments of improper payment risks. However, DOT must also consider risks beyond improper payments, both financial and non-financial. For example, some fraud can have safety consequences and other consequences, such as limiting competition. We are currently evaluating DOT's fraud risk assessments for its surface transportation programs, including those funded by EJA, in an audit we announced last year. A number of strategies can help mitigate the risks posed by fraud to DOT programs. It is critical to educate staff, grantee, and contractors on how to recognize, prevent, and report potential procurement and grant fraud. This is particularly important because of the extent to which DOT, like energy, has its grant funding flow from states to subrecipients and contractors who have less direct contact with the agency, as well as to new recipients and subrecipients who may have less experience managing federal funds. Our Office of Investigations conducts outreach to increase such awareness, but this outreach does not reach all stakeholders who may be knowledgeable about fraud-related activities. For example, prime contractors play essential roles in obtaining DBE participation and overseeing them. DOT and its grantees must each do their part to ensure contractors know their responsibilities to recognize and report suspected fraud. And such outreach is just one step in ensuring that each recipient of federal funds commits in its culture and structure to preventing fraud. Strengthening oversight is also vital to detecting and preventing fraud, waste, and mismanagement. Oversight at the DOT operating administration level and program level is the focus of much of our audit work, and we have found that DOT faces challenges in monitoring grantees' documentation to ensure they use funds as intended. An example of that was in our recent oversight and audit report of FAA's CARES Act grants, and to its credit, DOT has already taken steps to address the recommendations we made in that report. Nevertheless, opportunities remain to enhance DOT's oversight and safeguard federal funds. Our office is committed to supporting DOT in meeting its mission while strengthening its processes to prevent fraud, waste, and mismanagement on behalf of the American taxpayer. This concludes my prepared statement, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Soskin. Our final witness today will be Mr. Sean O'Donnell, who is the Inspector General at the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. O'Donnell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Obernolte, Ranking Member Fushi, and members of the committee. I'm Sean O'Donnell. I am the Inspector General for the United States Environmental Protection Agency. I would like to thank the committee for inviting me to testify about the EPA Office of Inspector General's efforts to protect American taxpayers from fraud, waste, and mismanagement. Although relatively small, our office has averaged nearly 60 reports a year for the last 10 years, yielding a return on investment of over 300%, and we are on pace to do even better this year. Indeed, during the last year, my office has risen to the challenge of overseeing critical EPA programs, from identifying cyber vulnerabilities in America's water sector to reporting potential waste in the EPA's wood heater changeout programs. And there's more to come. For example, we are auditing the nearly $50 million that the city of Jackson received from Mississippi's Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, and we've already uncovered evidence that the EPA may have instructed states to ignore single audit findings, such as those for the city of Jackson, when making award decisions. Following enactment of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we immediately began conducting oversight, starting with our inaugural IIJA oversight plan, released in April 2022. Since then, we have published nearly a dozen oversight products, as well as created an interactive web page. And we have 7 projects in progress and 6 more planned, covering such things as supply chain concerns and SRF capacity issues. Finally, our investigators are employing every tool available to us to fight fraud, from task force to data analytics. But we have our work cut out for us. For context, in any given year, the EPA manages around 6,000 grants totaling approximately $21 billion. Furthermore, through various infrastructure programs, the EPA has funded over $230 billion in water projects. And now the EPA faces the task of managing $100 billion from the IIJA and the Inflation Reduction Act. There are 4 challenges where we can help the EPA meet these challenges, 4 areas. The first, and arguably most important, relates to whistleblowers. From my very first day as Inspector General, I have encouraged whistleblowers and worked to vindicate their rights. This includes holding annual National Whistleblower Appreciation Day panels that draw more than 1,000 attendees. But encouraging and protecting whistleblowers is a responsibility we share with the EPA. Last month, we identified the need for the EPA's terms and conditions to specifically address whistleblower responsibilities. And we are working to partner with these new provisions with an official policy implementing statutory protections for recipient whistleblowers. Encouraging and protecting whistleblowers at the EPA starts with the EPA. We have recently reported on the EPA's failure to share whistleblower allegations of misconduct with us, particularly when related to science. We are working with the agency to ensure that we are promptly notified of these allegations, and we will continue to work with it to ensure that it has policies protecting its whistleblowers. The second area we are focused on is raising fraud awareness among EPA staff and stakeholders. Since the enactment of the IIJA, our investigators and auditors have conducted around 170 fraud or cyber security briefings, reaching nearly 4,000 attendees. And we recently identified the need for the EPA to implement best practices in alerting grantees to the consequences of fraudulent conduct and in reporting such conduct to the OIG. A third area of focus is ensuring the OIG access to agency and grantee information. To facilitate audits and investigations, regulatory provisions augment our subpoena authority by allowing us access to recipients and their records. A best practice we have identified is adding OIG access provisions to the EPA's terms and conditions. Finally, we are concerned about systemic issues related to the EPA's grant management. We found that the EPA's various offices stored grant files in disparate ways, from electronic media to paper files. And an EPA working group found that the agency uses 55 databases to store data from around 100 grant programs. From an oversight perspective, it hinders our ability to conduct effective oversight, limiting our ability to, for example, analyze historical data and suspicious trends. It also, from an administrative standpoint, hampers the EPA's ability to comprehensively and consistently manage grants. The EPA OIG is leading the fight against fraud, waste, and abuse. Moreover, we are doing so despite a decade of flat and declining budgets. Recognizing the need for IIJA-focused oversight, Congress provided us with dedicated funding. We are grateful for this support, and we're putting it to good use. However, we did not receive IRA funding to carry out IRA-focused oversight. On a positive note, the agency supports a reprogramming of funds for the OIG, converting some existing IRA dollars to dedicated oversight funding. I'm hopeful that Congress will recognize the value in doing so and take timely action. I thank you for your support and look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. O'Donnell, and thank you to all of you for your testimony. We'll now move to the member question and answers portion of our hearing, and I will go first by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I'm sure that everyone followed with increasingly distress and horror the shutdown of the Colonial Pipeline recently, where a loss and compromise of a single password resulted in a vital part of American infrastructure being shut down for several days, which disrupted oil supplies to the entire eastern United States. It was interesting to see that that was caused by the compromise of a single password. So I was very alarmed when recently I read a report from the Department of the Interior who conducted an investigation into their password security. And what they found was that over 20% of the passwords used in the DOI system were able to be easily hacked. They found that the most commonly used password was the word password followed by the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in fact, almost 5% of the passwords in use by users on the DOI system were some variation of the word password. So unfortunately, looking at our experience with consumers across the country, that behavior is not surprising. But in light of what happened at Colonial, I think it is very disturbing. I'm wondering if any of you have conducted similar investigations into password security at your agencies. I don't see any volunteers, so I'd like to ask you briefly if you'd be willing to undertake that task, because I think it's one that, you know, would not be difficult to accomplish, but could potentially be very important. And Mr. Martin?
Be happy to take that under consideration.
Ms. Lerner?
As would I.
I appreciate that. Ms. Donaldson?
Yes, and in fact, we already do cover.
The microphone, please. Thank you.
Second offense. We actually do a lot of work in the area of cybersecurity. So in fiscal year '21, we identified over 42,000 vulnerabilities across 12 sites at the Department of Energy. We still have 23 open 38 recommendations open from that work, and we will be issuing 35 new recommendations shortly. So we do a lot of work in that space, and some of that does cover the password-related issues. So there's a lot more work to go at the Department of Energy.
Well, I'm glad that you're focused on it. I know it's frustrating to have open recommendations, but keep pushing because that's how we get them closed. Mr. Soskin?
Chairman Obernolte, our Information Technology and Cybersecurity Audits Group on a rotating basis looks at, among other things, the cybersecurity of the department's operating administrations. Our recent reports on the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration found similar security vulnerabilities to what you're describing with passwords. And our audit of the Federal Transit Administration cybersecurity found shortcomings in their use of multi-factor authentication, which is an improved way of, as you all probably know from your use of bank accounts and other things that you personally secure, a better way than relying solely on a password. We continue to do that work, and we are heartened by the department's efforts to address our open recommendations. And we look forward to continuing to work with the department's new Chief Information Officer and relatively new Chief Information Security Officer as well.
Well, thank you, Mr. Soskin. Thank you for the good work. Mr. O'Donnell?
Thank you. For the last 2 years, we've identified cybersecurity, and in particular, cybersecurity of the critical water infrastructure, as a top management challenge. We will continue to do so, and I'd be happy to have my staff come and meet with you, your staff, to discuss the work we've done, including on passwords.
Okay, well, that's good. I'm in particular interested in the issue of passwords for two reasons. One, because it is such an easily solved problem if we elevate awareness of the issue. And second, because the consequences of failure to solve it could be so severe. The second thing I'd like to ask about is something I mentioned in my opening statement regarding the metrics for evaluating the success of the Office of the Inspector General. Your agencies represent such a wide variety of roles and responsibilities. I think it is very hard to come up with one universal metric for each of you to use to evaluate the performances of your office. So I'm wondering what metrics you either use or would suggest that we use to evaluate whether or not an IG is doing a good job in overseeing their agency. Anyone have a thought about that? Yes, sir.
And I'm sure my colleagues would tell you, every type of oversight is different. For us, I have built into the performance metrics of my entire staff timely and relevant work, high quality, timely work. But as an office, of course, we look at ROI, and as I said, for us, it's been around 300% for the last 10 years. We also look at the number of reports that we issue, but then there are those non-quantifiable ones. And as a former IG once shared, as I was commiserating about some tough responses from the agency on some of our reports, he said, when you're catching flack, you're over the target. And I kind of take that as a measure too. When we're catching flack from the agency, we know we're doing good work.
So you mentioned return on investment. How do you calculate that?
We do it through the various forms of potential monetary benefit, question costs, identified waste, and then, of course, returns to the government through fines, restitution, and the like.
And investment, do you actually track the manpower on each one of those investigations and assign a monetary value to it?
We do track the costs. In fact, I personally have a dashboard in my office where I get to see how many hours are billed to every project so that I can make sure that they're done efficiently.
Interesting. And you mentioned timeliness and relevance. How do you track those?
We do it, first of all, I think timeliness and relevance are hand in glove. Also quality, for me, is quality. And it's, again, measured in again, how quickly we respond to emergencies. How quickly are we responding to environmental emergencies that we need to do oversight of? For example, we just noticed an inquiry into the fuel spill at East Palestine. That's an example of me seeing my staff being timely and relevant to the issues that are affecting the EPA.
Sure. Well, I see I'm out of time. But I'd like to do some more thinking about this issue because it's difficult for us to do our oversight unless we have a metric by which we're evaluating you, and yet your roles are so diverse. I think that this is an important topic. So I thank you for your answers. At this point, I will yield 5 minutes to my distinguished colleague from North Carolina, Ms. Fucci, for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Inspector General Lerner, I'll direct these first questions to you. The National Science Foundation has a significant presence in my district. In the latest fiscal year, NSF awarded nearly $85 million to Duke University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill alone. NSF also supports cutting-edge research initiatives in the district, such as the Research Triangle, Nanotechnology Network, and the Athena Institute for Artificial Intelligence Research. I would like to learn more about how oversight from NSF OIG helps to strengthen the kind of research investments that are so important to districts like mine. So my first question is, how does oversight by the OIG benefit major research institutions that receive awards from NSF on a regular basis for scientific research?
Happy to answer that. One of the great things that our audit work does is dig into how people who receive NSF funds are using that money. And we take the results of what we find in our audits, and we deal not just with the issues and problems that we found at the institutions that we've audited, but we use our outreach program to share what we found with the research administration community and the research community, so they can see what problems they might have and try to solve them in their agencies, even though we aren't there to audit them. So we try to amplify the impact of our work by pushing it out and getting it to not just the people that we audit, but to the people that are in other agencies that can improve their programs based on what we found.
Thank you. And how does the OIG approach its oversight of research initiatives that span multiple research institutions and public, private, and academic stakeholders? Are there important distinctions in how the OIG evaluates these kinds of investments?
You know, I think we follow risk, and so when if we see a collaborative effort that has greater risk because of the nature of it, that will receive more attention from us. If it's an established program, it's less likely to. One of the areas that we're focusing on, right now is the development of new programs in the Technology Innovation and Partnership Directorate that are new to the agency, new to the academic community, and bring greater risks with them. So we are constantly trying to keep a finger on the risk environment and target our resources where appropriate.
And finally, how do the relationships that you build with stakeholders in the research community improve your ability to conduct oversight of NSF? And what can you do to develop those relationships even further?
One of the things that I've learned in 13 years in sitting in this role is that IGs can't make anyone do anything. We want to try to convince people through the strength of our work, but the strength of our relationships matter. And the benefit of having strong relationships with our agency and with the community that we audit is we can learn from them too, and they can come to us, especially when the pandemic hit. And the academic community, like the federal government, had to switch to a virtual environment. We were able to reach out to our network of people that we knew and get a sense of how they were responding to that change and how that might affect the risk environment. So we can learn from them, they can learn from us, and everyone is benefited.
And thank you. With the rest of my time, would anybody else on the panel like to add your observations to these previous questions? Well, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Congressman Posey, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Donaldson, has Department of Energy research grant funding and loans been used to generate actual commercial production by American companies?
You know, I would point to the work being done at the national labs to say that much of their spectacular work has a commercial application as well as the work that the NNSA labs do. So I would say, yes, that's not the type of thing that is tracked by my office, so I couldn't quantify that for you.
Okay, so do you think their office has a system to measure research to commercial production?
They probably have multiple systems because there's so many different programs, but I would imagine they're doing some tracking, at least in some of those programs.
Yeah, can you get back to me on what they're doing and kind of,
I certainly can.
thank you. Mr. Martin, when the space shuttle was winding down, NASA ramped up the number of firefighters that they had at Kennedy Space Center. Now with the launch cadence increasing from 57 last year to 97 this year, NASA's decreasing firefighters at the Kennedy Space Center. Can you tell me why? I mean, I was told there was a study on it, then I was told there was no study.
Yeah, Congressman, I was unaware of that situation until staff brought it to my attention yesterday. I'd be happy to look into it.
Okay, I have your commitment.
Yes, sir,
You'll get back to me. Thank
I
you.
will.
Now, this question is for each of you from left to right. I will start with Mr. Martin. How many investigations and audits has your office conducted within the last year, number one? How many of those, by percentage, involve China? Just roughly swag it. And did any of the China-related investigations require coordination of activities across other agencies or other inspector generals? And were any of these cases referred to the DOJ?
Yes, sir. We'll start. Investigations ongoing during the past year, 482 for the Office of Inspector General at NASA. How many of those by percentage involve China? Approximately 10%. And did any of the China investigations require coordination? And coordinated with several of my colleagues here at the table, including NSF and DOE. And a goodly number of our cases were referred to the Department of Justice and are under prosecutorial consideration right now.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The statistics that I have are for 5 years, so I can get back to you on the 1 year, other than I can say we worked 175 investigations in the past year. Many of those related to China. About 45% of our investigative portfolio right now are research security-related matters, many of which relate to China. And we, as I noted in my opening remarks, lead a cross-government working group that's focused on these sorts of research security investigations with the goal of improving the government's efforts, especially in situations where there are multiple agencies affected by a particular researcher's failure to disclose their relationships. So we are deeply involved in that, and will provide further information for you for the record.
Thank you.
Mic is on, so they're good at that. In fiscal year 2022, the Office of Investigations worked on 320 ongoing matters. 34 were grant fraud cases. Over a third of those were research security matters related to countries of concern, and all of those pertain to China.
How many refer to DOJ?
The bulk of our cases do eventually get referred to DOJ. We made a total of 61 referrals in this time frame, not all research security related.
Okay.
But over half of what we work on goes to the Department of Justice.
Thank you.
In this fiscal year, we have combined 447 complaints plus investigations in our inventory. As I mentioned, only a small fraction of the Department of Transportation's funding pertains to research and development, and consequently a smaller share of our investigations relate to China. I do not have numbers on that for you, but we could get back to you with that. As with the energy OIG, most of our investigations ultimately end up in consultation and referral to the Department of Justice. And I don't have a specific number on referrals either.
Thank you. Mr. O'Donnell?
Yes, thank you. And I'll give you as good a numbers as I can, but of course offer to come back and give clarity. We had, in the last fiscal year, 176 cases opened. The majority of those, I would say, is bread and butter, is either lab fraud or grant fraud, and that some small number involves China. And I must say that for IG Learner, her office is really the leaders for us in helping us identify China-related cases. But our work has recently resulted in a report we just issued encouraging the EPA to include grant terms and conditions provisions that require grantees to disclose any foreign sources that they get after they've received a grant. And of course, like my colleagues, most of our cases get referred to the Department of Justice.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Lofgren, for 5 minutes. Then we'll go to Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you so much, Chair Obernolte and also Ranking Member Fushi. Thank you to the witnesses as well. I appreciate the Office of Inspectors General and the goal of promoting transparency and accountability and protecting public trust. Ambitious funding for science policy, including research and development, is intended to lead to evidence-based decision-making and informed agency practices, and with strong oversight by your offices, we know when taxpayer dollars are used efficiently and effectively, and importantly, when policies are implemented as intended. I have a two-part question for you, Ms. Lerner. Your office published a white paper last month about the complexities of investigating and adjudicating sexual assault and stalking in the United States Antarctic Program. And I've worked a lot with NOAA on this issue, so I appreciate the careful consideration of both the complicated legal environment and also the imperative that responders and investigators be properly trained in a trauma-informed approach. And I hope that NSF, the prime contractor, and other stakeholders use this document as they work to address sexual assault, which is a criminal matter. But some of the issues raised in your white paper should also be considered in non-criminal matters such as sexual harassment, which is treated as a violation of the Code of Conduct. So what are the takeaways from the white paper that are also applicable in non-criminal contexts?
I think that ensuring that there is trust in the environment and there is not a fear of retaliation so that people can come forward with concerns is essential, whether you're dealing with a criminal violation or sexual harassment. And it's imperative that NSF and take action and ensure that the contractors and subcontractors down there are creating an environment where people feel that they can bring these matters forward. So that's first and foremost what has to happen there. There also needs to be clarity about what rights people have. We are in the process of conducting an inspection of what's happening in McMurdo and Antarctica, and what we're seeing is people don't understand where they can go when they've been assaulted or harassed, and we are going to produce products to help improve that, because it's essential to create a workplace that the people deserve.
Thank you. And the second part of the question is that it's likely that in many cases of sexual assault in Antarctica and other remote places, there may be sexual harassment as well as sexual assault. So one of those is a crime and another is a violation of the Code of Conduct. Some of the survivors of assault may choose not to file a criminal charge, but they still deserve a remedy and a safe environment. So when instituting better systems for intaking and adjudicating sexual assault, how can the institutions such as NSF guarantee that allegations of sexual harassment are treated with the same sort of support and investigation that someone and resources that someone who alleges a crime may have?
One of the things that we think is critical right now is that complaints go to an independent, trusted third party for assessment, and then that victims, if they choose to pursue criminal redress, are able to pursue that. If not, that there are strong and trusted mechanisms for handling matters administratively. And we are going to be providing input to NSF.
Thank you. We have a lot of conversations on this committee about diversifying the workforce. We need to make sure that employees are safe. Mr. O'Donnell, I have a question for you as well. The EPA website states, quote, the Portland Harbor Superfund site was added to EPA's national priorities list in December of 2000. Well, that was 23 years ago. So there has been some progress made, but sections of the Willamette River remain contaminated by heavy metals and industrial chemicals, posing risk to human health and the environment and affecting economic growth in the area. So what role does the EPA's Office of Inspectors General play in ensuring the successful execution of Superfund site cleanups? And how does maintaining rigorous oversight contribute to the effectiveness and accountability of this important environmental restoration project, which has been going on for decades?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I don't have my eyes specifically on the Portland Superfund site, but it's one that we'll definitely look at and get back to you on.
Appreciate that.
Since I have been at the OIG, I have begun the process of instituting inspections of Superfund sites and brownfield sites. Because for me, it is very important that we have sort of boots on the ground looking at what's going on, so that it's one thing to do accountability from afar. It's another thing to be right there, see what's happening, talk to the people who are there. We are doing that now down in Alabama. We are doing it in Missouri as well. And this is a portfolio we intend to expand.
Thank you. And I know your Region 10 folks have been involved, but 23 years, that's from the time that it was actually listed and added to the priorities list 23 years ago. And needless to say, costs of cleanup are not getting any lower. I'm sure they're significantly more as time goes on. So I appreciate your willingness to follow up on that. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Congressman Babin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, all of you IGs, for your expert testimony. It's very, very helpful. Many of the more controversial problems facing research agencies can be mitigated by ensuring agencies conduct their own due diligence and compliance audits. And two that come to mind are the duplicative Small Business Innovation Research Grants, SBIRs, and two, grantee connections to entities with known foreign economic espionage interests. Ms. Lerner, when you testified before this committee in 2009, you indicated that duplicative funding in which companies obtain payments from multiple SBIR agencies for the same work is the most frequent violation that we have found in NSF's SBIR program. Mr. Martin, a NASA IG report from 2009 also found that in analyzing investigations conducted by NASA, OIG, and others, we found that SBIR award recipients received multiple SBIR contracts for essentially the same research and provided duplicate deliverables or questionable research products. I understand a task force was established at the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency to address this issue over 10 years ago. However, under the Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act and Office of Management and Budget requirements, agency managers are required to establish effective internal controls themselves. So to the panel as a whole, what is the status of interagency SBIR duplication oversight? Is this task force still active? If not, why is it not? Has the problem gone away, or are the agencies doing a better job of conducting these compliance audits themselves? Do you have data to support either of these conclusions, and can you provide historical trend data related to SBIR grant duplication audits and findings for the record? So, Mr. Martin, if you would respond first, I would appreciate it.
Sure. Actually, if I could kick it to Allison first.
Okay.
She's the chair of the group, and then I'll supplement her.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And what I can say is that the group that we started after the hearing in 2009 is alive and well and had its most recent meeting just last month. It brings together agents from across government who are working these sorts of cases to highlight opportunities to work together, but also to figure out how to work better. And when we pursue cases, use the best set of facts and have the strongest possible outcome as a result of that. I'm happy to provide you with more detail about the specifics of what that group has accomplished. I'm really proud of it.
Thank you very much. And if y'all could keep it just as brief as you can, I may not have time to do my other questions, but
Sure. I would just say there's tremendous coordination and cooperation within the IG community to address these cases, but I still don't think there's a singular source that would indicate a duplication of effort by a grantee, that they're going to DOE for funding to NASA. We don't have that solution yet.
yeah, okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. It is definitely
Donovan.
still a problem for the Department of Energy. We still see those cases coming through. I think the answer lies in acquiring that transactional level, recipient level data and having a robust data analytics approach to the problem, much like what the CRAC has done on the pandemic spending. And I think a lot of the agencies are excited about that prospect, but not yet far enough along to be able to do it and share that information, have a data-driven approach.
Thank you. Mr. Soskin.
In our handful of research and development-related cases, we too have seen the need to coordinate with our OIG partners because they frequently involve cases where a grantee is seeking funds from multiple sources for the same work.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Yeah, thank you. Our SBIR cases are worked here, many of them with my colleagues here in their offices. With respect to the EPA, I've already spoken to our concerns with respect to its grant management practices. Generally, I think those concerns extend to their ability to conduct audit inside of their programs.
I know that you're all familiar with the Wolf Amendment, named after Frank Wolf. Mr. Martin, does the Wolf Amendment prohibit NASA from issuing research grants to individuals with connections to Chinese universities, especially institutions with known connections to the PLA or malign foreign talent recruitment programs?
Yes, sir, that is my understanding.
Okay. Several high-profile cases involving NASA researchers with connections to China were unsuccessfully prosecuted in recent years, and some of them because of the confusion over the existing law. And I was just wondering if a separate provision in the CHIPS and Science Act passed last summer requires all grant applicants to certify that they are not a party to a malign foreign talent recruitment program, just very, very, very quickly.
Yeah, that has proved helpful, the certification.
Yeah,
That's,
okay.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you very much, and I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. We'll now yield 5 minutes to the distinguished Congresswoman from Colorado, Ms. Caraveo.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to the witnesses today for being here. Americans certainly deserve full transparency and accountability of our science agencies, so I appreciate and support the work that you all do. I wanted to briefly highlight a program that I recently learned about, the National Science Foundation AI Institute for Student AI Teaming, which is being led by the University of Colorado at Boulder. The Institute is dedicated to transforming classrooms into more effective, engaging, and equitable learning environments to help realize the grand challenge of education for all by leading the nation toward a future where all students, especially those with identities that are underrepresented in STEM, routinely participate in rich and rewarding collaborative learning experiences. As a Latina in STEM and as the aunt of a young STEM enthusiast, learning about programs like these serve as a reminder of how critical funding and oversight for our science agencies is now and for generations to come. So for Inspector General Lerner, has your office recently assessed NSF's efforts to enhance inclusivity amongst agency grant recipients and research initiatives? And if so, can you please share some of your findings?
At this point, we don't have recent work on that topic, but it is an area that we have included in our management challenges. And as we formulate our audit plan for the upcoming year, we will hope to focus some resources on that.
I appreciate that plan, and I'm looking forward to what you find there. As a follow-up for the rest of the panel, do your offices have any plans to conduct any further audits related to inclusivity in any portion of NSF's research agenda?
I
ahead,
pushed
John.
it first.
Did you win? Go ahead.
Yeah. For us, for the last 3 years, environmental justice, and that's what matters at the EPA, is environmental justice has been a challenge that we've identified. I will tell you, I have personally spoken with the head of the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights to make the point that the $3 billion that they have to give to the IRA, it is not about who the recipient is, it's about who the beneficiaries are. And environmental justice is about the recipients, and we need to make sure that we have the internal controls that are protecting the funds that achieve the goals of those programs.
And Congresswoman,
Mr. Martin, yes.
Just to note that the Office of Inspector General at NASA just recently opened an audit looking at the effectiveness of the agency's STEM efforts. They invest about $108 million per year in STEM, and so we're going to assess the effectiveness of their efforts.
That's great, in particular, given that my niece is Latina and she is interested in a future in NASA. I'm glad to hear about those plans. And speaking of NASA, I did have a kind of separate question for you, Inspector General Martin. Based on your office's work, do you believe NASA's management of contractor performance has improved over time? Colorado has a big aerospace industry with several NASA contractors based out of the state, and so this interests me.
I think it ebbs and flows. It's program specific, the effectiveness of their contract oversight and project management.
And what are kind of future plans for oversight of it?
Well, the IG's office, we're involved in all the major programs, particularly the high-profile programs involved in the Artemis missions.
Perfect.
The rocket, the capsule, the ground infrastructure. We're keeping tabs on all of those.
Wonderful. I appreciate that, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Caraveo. We'll go next to the gentlewoman from Oklahoma, Ms. Bice. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. First, Ms. Donaldson, you shocked me with your numbers that you stated earlier that FY22 DOE spend was $44 billion, and because of the programs that were passed last year, you're looking at a $400 billion budget for the Department of Energy, and that is frightening given that a lot of those dollars are grant dollars. And my first question is for any of the panelists, and that is, do you believe that there is an issue with the grant awarding process, given that we have so many instances of grant fraud that have been identified through your agencies? And the reason I bring this up is an important one. I'm extremely excited to be a member of this committee for my second term, but I'm also a new committee member on the Appropriations Committee. And as I recall, Congress has the power of the purse, and I believe that we have abdicated that responsibility to agencies through this grant awarding program, across the board, and we're finding fraud, taxpayer fraud across the board. So I'd love maybe a little bit of insight about those grant programs that you all are overseeing. Open to anyone.
You want to run down the line?
Quickly.
Yeah, I think
Sure.
we would. Yeah, I think we've seen historically that the grant oversight capacity at our individual agencies is way underfunded. And so they don't conduct, because of the bandwidth issue, the contracting officers at the agency don't have enough hours in the day. They're pushing the money out, they annually appropriated each year. And secondly, we've seen that some universities don't conduct appropriate due diligence over the grants that are coming to the faculty and the researchers at their universities.
I think there's no one-size-fits-all answer, so I'll just give you the perspective from NSF. In the 13 years that I've been there, I've seen real improvements in the amount and sophistication of the oversight the agency provides to its recipients outside of my office, but they are still hard-pressed because of the limitations on funding that they have for that to touch as many things as would be ideal. But real progress has been made, but progress remains.
Anyone additional wanted to comment on that, or I can move forward because I do have another question.
I would just briefly add, and I want to amplify some concerns. The IIJA gave the EPA $60 billion. Most of that is going through familiar funding mechanisms like the state revolving funds. And so what we see are capacity issues at both the distribution and the recipients. But the IRA gave the EPA over $40 billion for entirely new programs that are going to entirely new recipients. And unfortunately for us, I think the biggest risk is Congress didn't fund oversight of this. And I gave one example recently of the Environmental Justice Office, which went from 12 components of about $12 million to now one component with $3 billion. And that's—
And no oversight.
I'm going to steal a term from Terry Donaldson. That's faster money to newer recipients, and we are very concerned about that and the ability to do effective oversight of it.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. To pivot for a moment, this is going to be directed at Ms. Donaldson. Secretary Granholm was a former board member of Proterra, which was an electric bus company, before joining the department. It is listed on her ethics agreement as a covered relationship for the first year under the federal regulations and 2 years under the Biden ethics pledge. She was required to divest her stock within 6 months of becoming secretary. The obligations require Secretary Granholm to be recused from matters involving Proterra or those that could directly and predictably benefit them. Yet she was personally involved in the DOE's Super Truck 3 program that ultimately saw the department hand out $80 million under the program. At least 3 of these recipients of Super Truck 3 grants announced personally by her at a public event with the words of 80 million are companies with ties to Proterra. Were you aware of this?
I was aware of part of that. I'm not sure that all of what you just said was familiar to me.
Okay. Dahmer, for instance, received $25 million in a Super Truck 3 grant. The company has made multiple large investments in Proterra and created exclusive partnerships between Dahmer commercial vehicle divisions and Proterra. While announcing its deal to go public, which involved an investment of more than $400 million from a group led by Dahmer Trucks, Proterra described the company as a strategic partner. Do you think there's a conflict of interest there, Ms. Donaldson?
I think whether or not there's a conflict would depend on applying the law to it. So depending on the timing of that, so if you divest and then participate, there may not be a conflict. So we do occasionally get items like that in the door. We lay out the legal framework, and then the answer emerges on the other side, sometimes based on timing.
But some of this information, admittedly, you were not aware of, is that correct?
That's part of that. I was not aware of the detail of it.
Okay. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bice. We'll go next to the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Lee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Western Pennsylvania, where I serve, has a rich history of relying heavily on the hard work and dedication of its workforce. Every dollar we spend is hard-earned. So it feels silly that we're here trying to scrutinize funding that will support further American leadership in scientific innovation and deployment, when last time I checked, the Department of Defense has consistently failed its annual audits. I want to address how strong worker protections through the IGs at agencies like the ones you represent will support further American leadership in scientific innovation and deployment. So my first question is directed to Mr. O'Donnell. With the investments of the IRA, how does your office help to ensure that your agency is operating efficiently and effectively while also upholding their commitment to worker protections?
So as I had mentioned, we did not get any funding to oversight IRA spending. I can tell you that with respect to IIJA spending, we already have planned a project on the agency's decision-making with respect to Build America, Buy America provisions. When we start doing inspections of project sites, it will include BABA checklists, Davis-Bacon protections, and the like. These are, I think, critical to what the government, the government's paying for something, the government wants to get what it's paid for, and we believe with that too.
Thank you. Can you discuss more about the success of your agency's human resources policies and practices that financially reward whistleblowers in support of the protection of scientific integrity, excuse me?
Thank you. Scientific integrity is always an issue at the EPA because I think, unlike a lot of agencies, it does science and it makes decisions based on science. In a series of reports, we've raised concerns about the agency's scientific integrity policy, and I think more importantly, its practice of not reporting allegations of scientific integrity or loss of scientific integrity to us. We have to find these sort of coincidentally. And so we are working with the agency to, as it's revising its scientific integrity policy, to make sure that it recognizes the unique, independent, and objective role of the EPA OIG in investigating those allegations. So that for us is very important. And then with respect to whistleblowing, I can tell you that I am instituting a policy, a program at the EPA OIG under 5 USC, I want to say 4712, but please don't quote me, where we will reward EPA whistleblowers, employees who come to us with identifiable cost savings, fraud, waste, and abuse.
Thank you. Finally, for you, Mr. O'Donnell, can you discuss how existing protocols supported and strengthened the investigations by your Office of the Newton County Superfund site?
Can I get back to you on the Newton Superfund site? We have looked at a number of Superfund sites. For us, a big thrust of that is in communicating to stakeholders in the community on the risks. And in fact, I can tell you we are releasing a report. It's on the 35th Avenue site in Alabama, but it really speaks to the EPA's ability or lack of ability to speak to the cumulative risks that are involved in a Superfund site: air, water, land.
Thank you. Ms. Lerner, how do you ensure that agency leaders are held accountable to make directorates like the new Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships more efficient in the formulation and implementation?
We engage early and often, especially when word of the new directorate, came through. We watch the agency's efforts. We ensure that the thoughts of efficiency and effectiveness and actions that can help prevent fraud are at the front of their minds as they plan. And we provide proactive advice as we can, like the other Transactions Authority report I mentioned earlier. So we engage early and often with them as appropriate while maintaining our independence.
Okay. In fact, very quickly, Mr. Soskin, from the financial impact of procurement and grant fraud investigations since 2017, how can oversight be improved to ensure as much funding as possible reaches our communities through the various programs and grant opportunities like the EPA's Clean School Bus Program? And what steps are you taking to address any areas for improvement?
One of the findings in our recent audits of the department's oversight of its procurement and contracts is in the need for the department to hire and retain and effectively train its contracting officers, its contracting officer representatives, so that they have enough to pay attention to each of their procurement initiatives, and so that they have the training required to provide oversight to those initiatives. And so in connection with their procurement, that's an important element for the department to pay attention to.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Lee. We'll go next to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Williams. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On April 5th, Mr. Obernolte and I sent a letter to the Secretary of Energy and we're requesting more information about the rampant culture of stock trading and total disregard for the conflict of interest laws. As I look over our letter, just to quote that hundreds of Department of Energy employees, including 1/3 of the department's senior employees, continue to hold stocks and other assets related to their official work, despite receiving notices from ethics officials. And there are literally hundreds of violations and thousands of transactions. Inspector General Donaldson, I'd like to acknowledge your testimony before the House Oversight Committee this week, and you mentioned the size and scale of the increased funding to the DOE, also in your opening comments today. I'm interested in how that may have played a role here. Specifically, this expanded budget, how exactly, in your opinion, has this contributed to this increase in conflict of interest trades and potential ethics violations?
Well, first I would point out that the conduct that you're describing may not constitute an ethical violation. So the Department of Energy's regulations of these activities focus on a specific matter. So if you're employed at the Department of Energy, you can in fact hold stock for a particular company as long as you don't work on a matter that impacts that company directly. So it's focused on the matter, not on the holding of the stock itself. And then there's a recusal mechanism. In the event something comes in front of you, you recuse and step away from it.
My understanding from the reports, thank you for that clarification, but my understanding from the reports is that there do appear to be a number of cases where matters before specific, even leaders and employees of the Department of Energy did hold stocks that would put them in a pretty clear conflict. Could you comment about your investigation and maybe your response to Mr. Obernolte and I's letter?
Yeah, we do work on investigations that look like this, but the way this process works is that those notices, these were mentioned in the Wall Street Journal articles, are sent out prophylactically. So if you hold stock in Exxon, you may get, and you're employed at the Department of Energy, you will get a notice that says, make sure you're not working on anything impacting Exxon. It's not a notice that you violated the law. It's sort of a prophylactic, be careful sort of notice. So I think there's some confusion in what those notices actually mean,
So,
which is inflating those numbers a bit.
okay. So when I was a junior banker, very briefly, the SEC certainly regulated our ability to make trades or to hold stocks related to any of the transactions that we might be working on. And this was just part of, I guess, part of the banking charter, and there's a whole compliance organization around that to ensure that kind of compliance. And so literally I could not even buy or sell stocks as an employee of the bank without prior approval. It seems in this case that, you know, either the rules and laws need to be clarified or strengthened, or perhaps there's room for additional investigation. Which direction is your office going with these with this news report and with the letter and information that we've requested?
Yeah, we are in fact launching a project looking at conflict of interest protections across federal agencies, because different agencies have different regulations with different impacts. So it is possible that there are, you know, different sorts of ways of approaching it. And some are more layered, and some do focus on the holding of the stock if your agency participates in regulating that entity. So there's different ways to come at it. We don't have a project that I can tell you what the results are yet, because we're just launching that, but it is an area that interests me.
And any comment about Mr. Obernolte and I's letter, its receipt, and actions being taken in your office?
It's again, it's an area that interests me. I am not aware of sort of a specific volume of cases that violate these rules. We have a pretty steady flow of allegations coming in. Some of them turn out to be a problem, and some turn out to be notices that were innocently sent and aren't a problem.
And I know my time's up, there's various degrees of smiles on your colleagues' faces, which indicates that perhaps the information that I need is you're not able to really comment on at this time. So I will, my time's up. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Williams. Next, we'll go to the gentleman also from New York, Mr. Bowman. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your testimony. I would love to see science, technology, and innovation centers built all over this country, particularly in historically marginalized rural and urban communities. And I believe that the CHIPS and Science Act gives us the opportunity to do that. However, there's a lack of infrastructure in place for some of the historically marginalized communities to identify, track, and then go after the resources that are available as part of the CHIPS and Science Act. My question is for everyone, and we could start to my left and go all the way down the line. Do your offices intend to assess how well agencies ensure equitable access to federal funding opportunities? And what do previous audits tell us about how agencies can be better at this?
So specifically, NASA did not receive any CHIPS Act funding on that. But, you know, NASA has its 10 centers across the country, Huntsville, Alabama, Johnson Space Center, et cetera, where the bulk of their, you know, civilian workforce and many of their contractors are. So I'll pass to the folks who actually got CHIPS funding.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
NSF did receive CHIPS funding, and it has many projects underway to address the issues that you raised, and I know that those will be the focus of our audit oversight in the future. The work that I can point to right now that we've done that's trying to improve people's ability, the ability of institutions that have received limited funds from federal research agencies, is our work looking at the EPSCoR program and trying to help NSF help its recipients do a better job of managing their money and managing their subrecipients, some of whom have even less experience than they do in managing federal funds.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. So the Department of Energy has been authorized to receive funds under CHIPS, but it has not yet been appropriated. They're going to be getting it in smaller allotments through the appropriations process. So I am situated more similarly to the first IG who answered this question.
DOT, like NASA, did not receive any CHIPS Act funding. We are aware of our department's ongoing efforts to expand its grants to university transportation centers and include more UTCs in those programs. I anticipate that's one activity by the department that will result in greater geographical reach. I would also note that the statutory requirements in many of the department's grant programs include both a rural and an urban breakdown, as was referenced in your question.
While EPA did not receive CHIPS Act money, it obviously received money across the board in IIJ and IRA, and of course the issue of environmental justice animates almost every aspect of what the EPA does. And I think if you looked at our reports, you'll see that many of them, even when they're not directed towards environmental justice, like, for example, our cybersecurity report, we still do touch on what are the consequences to communities like you say. So, for example, in the cybersecurity, we found that it was a smaller rural type of ones in disadvantaged communities that have not made it. And you know, our portfolio on this issue, on the EPA's ability and its subrecipients to make sure that disadvantaged communities participate is quite vast. And you know, I'd be happy to have my staff meet with yours to share you our great work in this subject.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. Thank you. My next question is for Inspector General Lerner. Last year, your office highlighted the need to address barriers in growing research capacity for emerging research institutions as a top management challenge. This is especially important for artificial intelligence. When large language models have shifted the landscape of cutting-edge research from universities to private labs backed by cloud giants, the National AI Research Resource, which NSF and OSTP are collaborating on, is an opportunity for us to level the playing field and democratize who can conduct cutting-edge AI research. How do you think public institutions like the NAIR or other programs that were created or expanded as part of the CHIPS and Science Act could help NSF address disparities in research capacity?
I believe that there are many things that those institutions could do at sharing their real-life experience of trying to bring new people into this immediate and growing conversation will help NSF do a better job at dispensing its funds. So I think that the strong connections that NSF has with institutions will make both entities' response to this new growing area of interest stronger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Bowman. We'll go next to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleischman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I wish to thank all of the panel. I know your job as Inspectors General is extremely, extremely difficult and important, so thank you to each and every one of you all. As you may or may not be aware, I am the chairman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee on Appropriations. I've been privileged to ask to come back to the Science Committee by the chairman, so glad to serve here. I just have one question, and I do believe, General Donaldson, you may have already touched on this, but in your previous answers, but in your testimony, you stated that Congress has authorized $67 billion to the Department of Energy through the CHIPS and Science Act, as well as appropriated $62 billion in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Please describe, if you will, the actions your office is taking to prevent fraud and waste in these programs. Thank you.
So one of the actions we're taking is to be over here and talking to appropriators so that we can be more appropriately funded to do the work. But while that is going on, we've launched a large-scale data acquisition and monitoring project, which will generate leads for audits and inspections. We've had approximately 30 meetings with the department. We're not allowed to consult or advise, but we ask a ton of questions, a lot of them about the 71 new programs. So we're actively in the coordinating and planning. Mr. Soskin and I chair the group of inspectors general that received funding under IIJA, so we meet every month with the other inspectors general, share best practices. So we're doing everything that we can given our underfunded status.
Thank you for your answer, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fleischman. We'll go next to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Frost. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're a nation recovering from a pandemic, facing threats abroad, and managing an existential climate crisis. Such big problems require big solutions, and solutions that can't just be left up to the states. Our federal agencies can take on these challenges, and I want to thank you all for your dedication to ensuring that the billions of dollars flowing through these agencies move as efficiently and effectively as possible to the important projects they fund. For example, Ms. Lerner, in your testimony, mentioned that NSF funds over 12,000 grants involving over 350,000 researchers. I'd like to know what steps do your office take to ensure the legitimacy of those researchers?
NSF has a first-class process for reviewing proposals that come in for investigative, for merit. They have two principles, intellectual merit and broadening participation that they focus on. And so their focus is on the quality of the research presented. There are vetting rules, that relate to NSF's own internal employees, but the focus of the awards that NSF makes is on the research that's proposed.
Gotcha, thank you. My state of Florida has received over 1,700 of those grants, which include almost 200 alone for the University of Central Florida in my district, Go Knights. One grantee in my district, Dr. Mindy Schoss, who my office recently connected with. Professor Schoss is an industrial psychologist, teacher, and researcher at UCF Go Knights, where when the FBI reported a 400% increase in cyber attacks in 2020, Professor Schoss actually used this grant from NSF to analyze employee behaviors for weak spots. And this was research that could secure an incredible amount of personal and commercial data. All of that came from a $170,000 NSF grant. Cybersecurity also means America working towards technological independence, and we can thank the CHIPS and Science Act for addressing the semiconductor shortage while creating 44,000 jobs in just 6 months. That includes 200 semiconductor jobs just south of my district in Kissimmee at a really cool place I recently just visited called Neo City. Which is a growing technical hub in Central Florida. Such sensitive research and technology has to be safeguarded. And so, Ms. Lerner, in your testimony, you mentioned working with NSF's Chief of Research Security. Could you elaborate on how your office works to protect sensitive scientific information?
Absolutely. We work closely with the CRISP, as she's referred to address issues, allegations relating to foreign affiliations that were undisclosed in NSF-funded research and other research security matters. And the CRISP handles the management aspects of those. Our office is there to look at potentially criminal behavior. And so, because sometimes complaints come to us that need to go to her, sometimes things come to us that need to come to her that need to go to us. So that's why we work really carefully together.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, I've made multiple trips to Cape Canaveral. I was born and raised in Orlando. I grew up standing in my backyard, seeing shuttles and tons of different, things go into space. And I also grew up seeing the Cape's transformation through the success of NASA's successful public-private partnerships that have revitalized Florida's space coast while delivering benefits for Americans across the country, from better weather forecasting to rural internet access. I actually just saw the Tempo launch, which was really exciting. Mr. Martin, how does your office work to make sure that sensitive, valuable aerospace technologies move securely within these partnerships and also within partnerships with other international space agencies?
So first off, go NASA. No, we have excellent cooperation with NASA's security force, and we do, as you pointed out, we do a lot of work and increasingly with our international partners. And so we are key on security for both the Kennedy Space Center itself and also vetting any international visitors to NASA facilities.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Mr. Martin. Yes, go NASA. If you want to send a member to space, let me know. And, I'll say, it was a program. President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget includes millions for underfunded IG offices, and I'm sure we could all agree with the president that we need more funding for our IG offices to ensure that this money is being spent correctly and efficiently, and that's the work y'all have been doing. I appreciate you coming in today. You've saved the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars and ensured that the money's going towards the big solutions that we need with the big problems we're facing. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Frost. We will go next to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Tenney. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for having this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for coming in today and for what you do to try to provide some oversight for spending. And the inflation that is being felt by Americans in my district is very real. Upstate New York, we are the highest taxed state in the nation now. We've taken over the chairman's state as number one. We have huge costs. We're facing catastrophic energy policy, in my opinion, that's coming to the state, and that's being felt by our farmers in the largest agricultural district in the Northeast, the largest dairy district in the Northeast, and only 3 nuclear power plants left in the entire state with emission-free baseload power to try to sustain us when we go to a zero fossil fuel-based system in New York very soon. But we're facing $31 trillion in debt. The federal government has lost hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars, as you know, to fraud, abuse, and waste. And I was looking through some of your reports here. While most of this, I understand, doesn't come under this committee's jurisdiction, we have the unemployment fraud, payroll protection plan. Those are under the COVID administrated funds. And SBA, $7 billion in military equipment left to the Taliban, among many of these other things. But as was recently discovered in the Department of Energy's Office of Science, that they failed to report $56 million in awards to for-profit research organizations. Further, hundreds of Department of Energy employees, including a third of senior employees, hold stock in companies directly under their jurisdiction, leading to potentially conflicts of interest. In addition, the Environmental Protection Agency recently noted that its PFBS, and I know those are their perfluorobuenosulfide, I can't put the word out there, toxicity assessment did not follow scientific integrity standards, rendering the report's contents unusable. And then, to top it all off, the EPA has been unable to track the impact of its pandemic grants, calling into question its ability to conduct basic due diligence and track the fraud, abuse, and waste with those funds. With the Inflation Reduction Act, which Mr. Fleischman and you indicated was $62 billion, the $67 billion infrastructure bill, and all of these monies going into, in a de facto, in a sense, a slush fund for the Biden administration to implement the Green New Deal. And let me be clear, the IRA was touted as the Green New Deal, the biggest the biggest green energy bill ever in the history of the United States before they talked about the Inflation Reduction Act. Apparently, inflation's tough to get rid of when you keep spending. But it is more important now that Congress does something about stopping this wasteful spending, and there's no greater obligation on our part to look to you as our Inspector Generals to say we have to control and figure out what's going on with taxpayer dollars, especially where we have such high taxes and such high inflation. So I have a number of questions. I want to open this up to, I guess, some of maybe Ms. Donaldson on this teleworking policies that have impacted the prevalence of fraud, abuse, and waste. Have they impacted waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars? And has it changed your oversight capacity by not having people in the office to actually see and touch and be there to make accountability? Your mic on, yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you, sorry. The Department of Energy is just initiated a study of the impacts on teleworking, so we don't have any published materials to talk about.
Well, let me ask you, what's your personal opinion on that? I mean, do you think people should be coming back to work, or do you think that we need to continue this telecommuting now that the pandemic has been declared over by our president some time ago?
Well, I can tell you what's going on in my shop, and I think it's working well. So we do allow maximum teleworking, but encourage people to come in more often than those requirements. And we have a lot of people coming in 3, 4, and even 5 days a week. So we're seeing, even though it's not a forced march, we're seeing a migration back to the office, which I think is very valuable.
But has this impacted your ability to do oversight? Because in your documents here, you've outlined there's a number of issues we need help with.
Yeah, I would say the greater impact is that I don't have the funds to hire people. My existing staff are working very hard in a maximum teleworking capacity.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, I just wanted to ask on NASA, and thank you for the work that you do and for putting this out, but we have seen the methodologies and some failures in project management, which were indicated in one of the reports. For example, the James Webb Telescope took 20 years to build. It was supposed to be $1 billion, ended up being $10 billion. How do we solve this issue? And I think I'm running out of time, but if you may answer, is there a methodology we could change or use to make NASA more efficient, more effective, and accountable to the taxpayers? And we love what you do, but this is a huge issue.
It is a huge issue, and NASA's been struggling it, frankly, for decades. I think they need to do better cost estimation at the front end. You mentioned the James Webb Space Telescope, pitched as a $1 billion 10-year project, morphed into a $10 billion 20-year project. And let me make a point. The fact is $10 billion worth of Webb Space Telescope, it may be worth $10 billion, but when you pitch it as a $1 billion project and manage it, and it balloons $9 billion, you've pushed out other science that could be undertaken, other opportunities for space exploration. So NASA contract management and project management.
My time's expired, but maybe offline you could just give me an answer of how we could improve the methodologies of NASA to make it more efficient and to meet some of the targets that we have. Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Congresswoman Tenney. We'll go next to the gentleman also from New York, Mr. Tonko. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank Chair Obernolte and Ranking Member Lofgren for hosting the hearing today, and certainly to our witnesses for your appearance. I believe that big problems absolutely require big solutions. From the climate crisis that was ignored for about 4 years and crumbling infrastructure to our global competitiveness in advanced manufacturing, the American people need for us to lead. And so in the 117th Congress, that is exactly what we did. Lofty investments for lofty challenges, monumental pieces of legislation, once-in-a-generation investments that were signed into law by President Biden. And now we have passed the baton to our distinguished panelists to finish the job on behalf of all Americans. My colleagues and I in Congress will be watching and doing our part to make certain your agencies have the necessary support to make the most of these landmark pieces of legislation. Let me begin with scientific integrity. I believe that it's a cornerstone of federal scientific activities and something that I've made a priority during my time in Congress by authorizing the Scientific Integrity Act. What do you all believe is the appropriate role for OIGs in defending scientific integrity at federal agencies and responding to alleged violations of agency scientific integrity policies? And this is a question for each and every one of you. Who would like to start? Mr. O'Donnell?
I will start. As I said earlier, EPA is an agency that relies on science in making its decisions. It does science internally, and I think that it struggles with loss or allegations of loss of scientific integrity are well documented, in part by us. One of the hurdles that we experience at the EPA is that we are not finding out about allegations of loss of scientific integrity except by coincidence during our review of the PFBS toxicity assessment. We find out that senior officials in the agency know that there were allegations of misconduct, but we were not told about it. We saw this with respect to dicamba, ethylene oxide. It is a recurring problem. We have been working for the last 2 years with the agency to try and make clear our role, and I believe agency policy speaks to this, that we are the only independent agency or a unit in the agency that can guarantee the confidentiality of witnesses and whistleblowers that come to us, and that the agency needs to remember to bring us those allegations as quickly as possible, because I say this to them all the time. The American people need to believe you're acting with integrity. Not just that you are, but they believe it. And they believe it because we act independently to show that you're acting with integrity.
Mr. Soskin, do you have any comments in that regard?
Yeah. We are dedicated to pursuing any and all allegations that are brought to us and fall within our jurisdiction, particularly related to fraud or of criminal activity. And while the Department of Transportation is not principally a science agency, we did highlight in our top management challenges report this year the important need for the department to make its decisions related to its safety mission, related to promoting innovation in our transportation system, to make those decisions based on good data and to be robust in its processes to identify and acquire the data that it needs to make sure its decision-making is data-driven.
Thank you. Ms. Donaldson, please.
Yes, so the Office of Inspector General primarily is in a responsive mode, so we respond to specific allegations. I don't have any ongoing projects that look at scientific integrity writ large. So an allegation comes in, we'll look at it, decide what's happened, criminal, civil, whatever it may be.
Thank you. And Ms. Lerner.
So NSF funds research, but none of our employees actually conduct science. So we don't have specific scientific integrity responsibilities, but we do conduct oversight of people who receive NSF funding. We conduct research misconduct investigations when there are allegations of fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in NSF-funded research. And that's how we promote research integrity.
And thank you. And Mr. Martin, please.
Right, I think we're much more similar to Ms. Donaldson, IG Donaldson. We're in a reactive mode when allegations are raised to the Office of Inspector General. We coordinate closely with the department itself.
Okay, and perhaps since Mr. O'Donnell had the most to say on this topic, how can the OIG coordinate with scientific integrity officials and other agency leaders to preserve scientific integrity and enhance scientific integrity best practices?
Thank you. As I said, for the last 2 years, we've been working with the Scientific Integrity Office to try and institute coordination procedures exactly like you are speaking to ensure that we're notified of these. And I understand for my colleagues, for them it's mostly reactive, but for us, we are proactive. We hold whistleblower events. We speak to scientific integrity issues to the agency, and we remind employees that we can help them if there are allegations of misconduct. And in fact, I stood up an administrative investigations directorate that is absolutely full in its docket with scientific integrity allegation issues. And so when we speak on those issues, we really are being, I think, proactive in the future.
And have they been longstanding?
The complaints?
Or the concerns that you expressed today, have they been longstanding?
Oh, those concerns are very longstanding.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. We will go next to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Baird. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all the witnesses being here today. Appreciate your testimony. And so the questions I have deal with the office. Ms. Donaldson, going to direct this to you. Conduct oversight on classified programs at the Department of Energy. But instead, the oversight of classified programs at the Department of Energy is conducted by internal unit known as the Enterprise Associates. And so your office conducts oversight of Enterprise Associates, essentially to grade their work. So can you please explain to us how your office does not conduct oversight if you believe that this should be changed?
The microphone, please.
So at the Department of Energy, we do split this work. So my shop does the cybersecurity reviews on the non-class system, and then the Office of Enterprise Assessments does very similar work in connection with the classified systems. The way that we interact, we do conduct oversight of the Office of Enterprise Assessments. So there's a series of meetings reviewing the work. So it's more tightly woven than you might think. Others have asked me whether or not my shop should take over the cybersecurity reviews for the classified system. Right now, as underfunded as we are, that would be a challenge, but that's certainly possible in the future.
Can you give me some idea how often you do that? Is this an annual review? Is it an annual review or periodic or whatever?
So it works in two ways. There is a required annual review, And then there are whatever other projects we do along the way that are designed and done in parallel to the annual review.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Ms. Lerner, I'm going to move to you next. You know, the Antarctic is not claimed as a territory by any nation. Therefore, international implications exist in the implementation and enforcement of laws. Can you provide the committee with the main international challenges that have arisen surrounding this issue?
At this point, I think the two that I'm aware of deal with, you know, if a criminal act occurs in Antarctica, you know, who has jurisdiction over the investigation of that? Whether if it occurs in a U.S.-funded research base, is that the United States' responsibility, or are there other nations that could exert responsibility for that investigation? And the second issue is if someone is found to have committed a crime and needs to be removed from Antarctica, typically they leave Antarctica and travel out through New Zealand, and there are challenges of moving a prisoner through New Zealand that need to be worked out.
So could you elaborate a little bit on your relationship with the United Nations in that regard?
I have none. I'm happy to talk to anyone about these matters, but this would be, I think, more NSF's responsibility as the manager of the program to engage with, you know, all the Department of State, the United, you know, and the government of New Zealand, and sort these issues out.
Thank you. Let's take a different approach. The main law enforcement officer is deputized through the Special Deputy Marshals.
Yes.
Has the IG coordinated with the Deputy Marshal Service? And can you provide the committee with more details on the relationship of NSF and OIG and how that maintains a relationship with the Marshal Service?
We have a strong relationship with NSF, and in fact, NSF supported our sending a team of three, one auditor and two investigators down to Antarctica in February. And among other people, they met with the deputy station manager. So he's responsive to us when we have questions. He does not work for us. His responsibility in investigating crimes is to coordinate with the Marshal's Office and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Hawaii.
One last quick question. Is there a U.S. Marshal in the area all the time in Antarctica? Or?
The only person with a connection to the Marshal Service on a regular basis is the the station manager. There are no other U.S. Marshals folks on a regular basis in Antarctica.
Thank you all very much. My time is up, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Baird. We will go next to the gentlewoman from Michigan. Ms. Stevens, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sexual harassment and assault creates a hostile environment for women in science and affects their ability to achieve their full potential. Ms. Lerner, this committee held a hearing in December of last year about sexual harassment and assault in the United States Antarctic Program. An NSF Commission report described harrowing stories about what scientists and contractors have endured and the failure of the agency and of Leidos, the prime contractor, to hold perpetrators accountable. I'm glad to see the OIG is engaged. Last month, your office released a white paper describing the law enforcement-related difficulties in Antarctica. Can you briefly summarize why Antarctica poses unique challenges when dealing with crimes committed to the continent?
Absolutely. I mean, let's start with just its general isolation. It's more like being on the moon than being anywhere else on the planet, and it's about as challenging to get there, although not as expensive. Not as expensive, I'll give you that. Beyond that, the mass of people with folks down there complicates who's in charge when it's a non-criminal matter. From a criminal perspective, having a station manager who's deputized as a U.S. Marshal is, you know, we think not the most effective way to provide criminal avenues to victims of crime. For anything that's not criminal, the fact that you have some NSF employees down there, some contractor employees, some subcontractor employees, and then scientific researchers from the United States, and then a whole passel of people that come through McMurdo in particular from other nations, you know, brings great complexity to the
So,
process.
and NSF's testimony at the December hearing indicated that the agency is considering significant changes to the structure of the USAP contract to address the findings of the SAPR report. So how do you think the OIG might be able to play a part in investigations in a revamped U.S. Antarctic program? And do you think the OIG should have a presence on the ice?
We are open to doing that. After reading the SAPR report, I sat down with my head of investigations and said, I think we've never done this, but we've got to look at this, and we are absolutely open to doing that. In fact, my head of investigations is down at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center right now, taking training in investigating sexual assaults.
Excellent. And so this committee has and will continue to engage in active oversight over sexual assault and harassment in the Antarctica, and we're eager to review future work from your office. Any preview that you can give us of forthcoming work that will come from your office on this topic?
Absolutely. We have an inspection that we're working on that'll focus on reporting and investigating sexual assault and what we've learned about that. And I think our next area of focus is going to be on reporting and investigating sexual harassment. And we're also looking at safety and health issues that came to our attention during our time on site. So we will have, ongoing work in this area for some time.
Thank you. And Mr. O'Donnell, under the prior administration, our federal science agencies faced a crisis of scientific integrity. This was a topic of conversation before we headed into COVID-19 and certainly after, in your office has certainly done some very significant work in confronting attacks on science, and you've issued reports. This is something that Mr. Tonko and I have also worked on together. What lessons did you learn from the recent four-year crisis of scientific integrity, and what steps can you and other OIGs take to ensure that you are equipped to deal with similar problems in the future?
Of course, it's generalized, but I think some of the lessons we learned was that it was important to communicate to EPA staff, EPA scientific staff, that there is a mechanism for reporting allegations of misconduct, and that by reporting to the OIG, their confidentiality can be protected. I know that if we go back to the time period of which you speak, the Scientific Integrity Office would often express their frustration and the inability to protect confidentiality. And of course, I'm always reminding them that we are, by law, the only entity in the EPA that can protect confidentiality.
Do you have the resources you need?
As I said, I created an administrative investigations directorate of about 6 lawyers and 2 investigators. Their docket is so incredibly full right now with complaints that I promise you, for every new investigator we could get, we would take on 4 more cases.
It's the investigation of the investigations.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for your testimony today and your time. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Congresswoman Stevens. We'll go next to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. O'Donnell, in a report on April 13th of this year, the EPA OIG discussed their concerns on whether foreign gifts could be linked to federally funded awards, as there is no post-grant award reporting requirements for the EPA research grant recipients to disclose foreign support. Thank you for bringing this issue to light. I think it's important. Are there any other concerns similar to this that you could identify today? And have you seen any instances where foreign adversaries such as China, Russia, Iran, or anybody else benefited from grant money awarded by the EPA?
I think I spoke to this earlier. Our office investigation prioritizes these issues, and we wanted to bring to light to the EPA the fact that it doesn't memorialize a requirement to identify post-award support from foreign actors. And that report speaks to some of the issues that we had seen where we had seen support from foreign actors, but I think we were unable to prosecute those cases. And again, those are ones we worked collaboratively. I believe those came from the Department of Education working with NSF OIG. And so we will continue to work with the agency to make sure that they institute that. As far as the technology loss, we haven't yet assessed that.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, according to your 2022 annual OIG report, the individual Artemis missions have estimated $4.1 billion per launch cost. According to your reports, this obviously having an impact on the lifetime or lifeline for the Artemis program launches. The question I have for you is what can be done at NASA or by Congress to improve the efficiency and speed of the program and how we reduce costs per launch?
And as I indicated, NASA is focusing on that. Again, part of what was the sole source contracting nature that underlies the rocket, known as the Space Launch System, and the capsule known as Orion. In fact, Congress directed that NASA use the old contractors that were involved in what was known as the Constellation program. It was the previous administration's return to the moon. So that, I think, put NASA behind the 8 ball at the outset. And then, as I've indicated, both contract management and project management have kind of gone off the rails at different times, and we've seen incredible substantial increases in the cost and in the schedule to these programs. NASA compounds those with its use, we find, inappropriate at times, of excess award fees to the contractors, even when the programs are slipping years behind and hundreds of billions of dollars over cost.
So to drill down on that, that's actually a really interesting point I wasn't aware of. Do you think that that's a NASA problem or a congressional oversight problem or a combination thereof?
I would assume it's a combination of both.
Okay, that's good to know. What do you think we can do to improve the condition of the International Space Station? And does withdrawal of Russia coming out of there in 2024, is that going to impact that also?
We've done significant amount of audit review looking at the future, both the economy in low Earth orbit that NASA is trying to promote, low Earth economy, but it has a decided end of life. Right now it's extended till 2024. I think Congress is on the precipice of extending it to 2030, but I think by 2030 you kick the tires, it's going to be ready to be deorbited, which is going to be a very expensive, very complicated activity to do itself to deorbit that safely.
Is it a useful facility though from 2024 to 2030 if we extend it, and you just mentioned the decommission without really in a discussion of replacement, which has to be the next piece of that also.
Right. It's an absolutely essential part of NASA's space exploration efforts. When NASA needs, the country needs, a low Earth orbit destination to conduct microgravity research, both on the health of human astronauts, but also on technology demonstrations. So it's critical. And what really concerns us the most, obviously the safety of the occupants of the International Space Station at the current time, but what we're concerned about is when it is decommissioned in 2030 or whenever, that there's not a gap, that there is something to follow, that NASA has that ability to conduct this critical low Earth orbit research.
And to your knowledge, do we have any plans to realistically have that replaced on time?
NASA has a plan. They're going commercial, which I think makes a lot of sense. But our office is still concerned that there is going to be a gap, which I think is going to be highly detrimental.
Okay, thank you. I yield.
Thank you, Congressman McCormick. We'll go next to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to everybody for taking the time today. Mr. O'Donnell, I'd like to start with you. A couple weeks ago, your office issued a report called, the title was, "The EPA's January 2021 PFBS Toxicity Assessment Did Not Uphold the Agency's Commitments to Scientific Integrity and Information Quality." I see you nodding. You've read it thoroughly. In that report, it said, quote, "During final clearance, a political appointee from the previous administration directed that a last-minute review be conducted of the uncertainty factors used to calculate toxicity values, resulting in scientific disagreement that caused delay, confusion, and significant changes to the near-final peer-reviewed work product." There was a recent Guardian analysis that went on, an investigative article that went on to say that the EPA career employees who, during the previous administration, had meddled in agency science to weaken toxicity assessments had never been reprimanded, never been fired, and flagged that there was a continuing problem affecting EPA, specifically an unwillingness to address industry influence on career staff. I want to start just by asking if you agree with or want to add any color to what the Guardian reported based on your report about sort of the backward-looking analysis. Is this an ongoing problem?
It is an ongoing problem. As I said, I have stood up a group devoted to investigating allegations of lost scientific integrity. It has been one of our top management challenges for the last 3 years. And that report speaks to the continuing issue. And I think what for me is most disheartening about that report is that the agency disagreed with every single one of our recommendations to try and improve the scientific integrity protections.
In your view, is there, and maybe this is the answer to that concern, is there an ongoing problem with industry influence, and is there something we need to do about that?
Issues of industry influence, well, that exists far beyond science. Remember, the EPA does a lot of science. It does a lot of rulemaking, and for us, this touches on it, not just on the conflicts of interest with respect to the science, but with respect to the rulemaking, and it's an issue that is live for us now, even now.
Are there things you're watching for as a sign of improvement, or that we can do to help you hold them accountable and make sure we do hold them accountable for the concerns you flagged from the past administration?
I meet with my staff meets with the scientific integrity office regularly. We are trying to improve that relationship. I will meet with the deputy administrator tomorrow to talk about this specific issue. And it's my hope, and I believe their commitment to improve things, but I'm happy to keep you posted on how things are going for us.
Okay, thank you. Moving to Inspector General Donaldson, the DOE's Environmental Management Program, as you know, is responsible for all things nuclear waste, cleaning up contaminated sites, safe storage. I don't need to go on, you understand all those issues. The GAO has fairly consistently had that DOE Environmental Management Program, which I think has about a $7.9 billion budget, on their high-risk list for some time. I wonder, just in the first question is just, do you agree with GAO's assessment that the DOE's Environmental Management Program needs improvement?
I do.
In 2020, there was a GAO report that said that 45 of their recommendations related to the high-risk area remained open, including recommendations pertaining to things like ensuring that costs and schedule estimates met best practices, incorporating project management best practices. That was 2020. Has there been any improvement in your view since that time?
I'm not sure I could comment on that comfortably without actually going back and looking at those specific recommendations and then getting an update from the department. So
Okay.
nothing immediately comes to mind as a informed response.
Okay. Well, in that case, then, would you like to add any color to your initial response? I do. Recognize this is not a wedding, but
Right.
is there any more color?
So we work very closely with the General Accounting Office. So we review we deconflict our work, we talk to them about what they're doing. They've done a lot of work in this space, and they have had the EM program on that list for a very long time. And it's due in part to that being the largest environmental liability known to man at this point in time, possibly even planet Earth-wise. So it's a tremendous amount of money. And it's managed in little snapshots called annual appropriations, which make it very hard to conduct efficient cleanups. And then across that complex, you also have consent agreements that are complicated, involve multiple parties. And so in order to improve your plan at a particular site, you have to go back in front of a district court judge, modify your consent agreement. So there's a lot of baked-in risk and turmoil managing this huge environmental portfolio.
So that's
why
interesting.
I gave that
And I don't know if you meant it this way, are you suggesting that if we maybe did more than just one-year appropriation, some of these problems would go away?
That observation has been made by many folks, and there's a lot of common sense to that.
I've heard that in a few other of our programs as well, every once in a while. Well, if there's anything, in my next election, I'm going to run for king, and I'll fix that. Barring that, barring that, anything we can do to help, please let us know, and thank you all for your service.
Appreciate that.
Thank you, Congressman Caston. We will go next to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Inspector General Soskin, I think it's safe to say that the Department of Transportation is currently a mess because Pete Buttigieg is focused on his left-wing social agenda more than building and maintaining our nation's critical infrastructure. There's a case in point. While Ohioans in East Palestine were fleeing their homes and worried about their health, Buttigieg refused to visit. But he found time to go on TV and say that there are too many white people working in the construction business. And a few days ago, he basically said that the roads and car accidents are racist. In your work reviewing the department's decision-making about grants and procurement, has the Secretary's radicalism on social issues affected how the department is making decisions?
Our reviews of the department's grant making and procurement have focused on a number of challenges that the department faces, and many of those relate to their efforts to administer the large volumes of pandemic oversight or pandemic-related and Infrastructure Act funds. GAO has done some reporting on the decision-making in discretionary grant programs, following up on work that we have done over time. Ultimately, the department's success and failure in these programs is a responsibility of department leadership. And we're optimistic that if our recommendations are embraced, these funds will be administered to the benefit of the nation's transportation system.
Right, but I think making a decision on how you appropriate those funds out should be based on the ability to do the work and not based on a social agenda. So that's what I was wondering if you were looking into that side of it.
We don't have any current work looking at the decision-making criteria in the discretionary grant programs.
I'd like to switch gears just a little bit then. I seem to remember a previous cabinet secretary during a previous administration being forced to resign for taking private jets, just like Secretary Buttigieg is doing. Are you currently looking into Buttigieg's travel choices? And if so, is there any indication of any waste or abuse? Do you see a double standard with how Secretary Price was treated versus Buttigieg?
Earlier this year, we announced an audit of the Office of the Secretary of Transportation's compliance with regulations and policies for executive travel on FAA's 40 aircraft, which are used for multiple purposes, including the Secretary's travel. At this time, that work is ongoing, and it's too soon to share any findings.
Do you have an estimation when you'll have that available?
At this point, I don't have an estimate for you.
How long does it normally take to do something like that?
We set as our goal for timely audit completion an 11-month time period. Frankly, we haven't been successful in always meeting that timetable, but one of our priorities and a priority of our new principal in overseeing our audits is to make progress on the timeliness of our audits.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. That's all I got.
All right, thank you very much, Congressman Collins. We are awaiting questions from one final member. So out of a courtesy, we will give him a couple more minutes to get here, and rather than sitting here in silence, I will exercise the chair's prerogative and ask an additional question of Mr. Martin. Chairman Lucas.
Or we could wait.
That's a nice try. Chairman Lucas and I sent a letter to NASA a few weeks ago expressing some concerns about the remote work policies at that agency. Specifically, we had been alarmed to discover that in the first several months of this year, over 50% of NASA employees were apparently working remotely instead of working on site. And to be clear, I'm not an opponent of remote work, and I know the chairman is not either. However, it's undeniably true that there are many circumstances at NASA that either require or certainly would be much more productively accomplished by people that are there at the job. I understand that the agency responded to our inquiry this morning, and although we are still digesting that, it seems like they are verifying that the salient points that we raised in our letter are true. I'm wondering, have you conducted any investigations related to remote work policies at NASA? And are you concerned, as we are, about the potential for reduced productivity as a result of those policies?
Sure. So in order, we have not conducted any investigations regarding overall agency remote work policies. I will say that being part of the NASA conversation during COVID, NASA was coming out of COVID and was leaning pretty significantly into workplace flexibilities. Back then and now, they were pushing this down to the center-based decision or project-based decisions about what the proper cadence of on-site versus telework was. I think it needs personally, and what we're trying to do at the OIG ourselves, is mission-focused. There are certain occupations, certain roles, and certain times during certain projects where on-site work is absolutely critical and essential. We have a computer crimes laboratory that's staffed in person every day because of the equipment and because of the sensitivity of the information. That has to be on-site work. And certainly if you're involved in a NASA flight project where you're bending metal in a clean room, you need to be on-site. So I do have concerns. We're going to incorporate these types of questions and these types of issues into our ongoing audits that we do across the agency.
All right, I appreciate that. We're going to continue our oversight as well. And again, this isn't out of any sense that we are anti-remote work, but certainly there are disciplines that we've identified in our research, including, for example, space hardware mechanics, where it's hard to understand how remote work could be done effectively. So I appreciate you continuing to work with us on that. And we're going to buy another minute or two here. Ms. Donaldson, I was really, really interested in the part of your testimony where you talked about the incredible increase in the research budget at DOE that's been placed on your agency by recent federal legislation. In a way, it's an embarrassment of riches, right? Because it's great that we've got these resources to do this research that we've long wanted to do. But I was not maybe sufficiently aware at how under-resourced your office was to deal with this influx of what is obviously an increased need for oversight. Can you go into a little bit of detail about what kind of resources you need and would think appropriate to be able to conduct the oversight that you think is necessary? Microphone, please, if you would.
I can. So I can tell you how I approached it to determine, what amount of resources would be sort of a first installment. So I looked first at how other inspectors general were funded, just the CFO Act agencies, independent of the new legislation. I found myself at the bottom, or arguably second to the bottom, on that list for historic underfunding. Then I looked at the new funding streams, and I looked again to how other inspectors general impacted by those funding streams how they had fared. And again, my shop had fared at that point completely at the bottom of that list. So we did some additional benchmarking and discovered that 0.35% puts you sort of in the middle of the pack for inspectors general, middle to low end.
So I'm sorry, 0.35% of
the
grant
agencies.
funding
Correct.
awarded to an agency being
That's right.
steered to the OIG.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. So it's a good way to do it, because if you think about it, it allows you to do those audits, inspections, and investigations. So you're growing with the portfolio of the agency. So I think that's a common metric that IGs look at, more money going out. And then I looked at all the risk factors at the Department of Energy, and there are a lot of risk factors, so much of the funding going to the states, those kinds of things. But I still kept that number pretty modest at the 0.35. And then in the materials, I always caution that does not include a huge number for the loan portfolio. So it's my intention
the what portfolio?
for the loan portfolio,
Okay.
which is about half of the money going to the Department of Energy. So we'll be coming back for a second installment. So as it is now, we're about $180 million short in our base budget and over $300 million short in connection with IIJ, CHIPS Act, IRA, and the legislation for Puerto Rico. Big numbers.
Sure. Well, a couple things I think have become clear to me as a result of this discussion. Number one, perhaps there's an additional metric we ought to be looking at to figure out whether or not our inspector generals are adequately funded based on the amount of activity that they have to oversee. And also, I think that we here in Congress need to be more mindful when we are awarding grant funding of making sure that we simultaneously award your offices the relatively modest in comparison amount of money that you need to conduct oversight of that funding. But I mean, let me ask you this, just playing devil's advocate. I think it would be very difficult in your position when Congress really radically varies the amount of grant funding available to your agency from year to year. How would you staff up and down your agency in response to that? I think that would be very difficult to manage.
Yeah, it presents some challenges, but it is doable. So the Department of Energy is now quadrupling in size and faced with that exact same challenge. So one of the things we would do, similar to what they're doing, is hire more people. But we have another little tool in our tool bag, which is the use of accounting firms to do some of the audit and inspection work. So you can retain those entities to do focused work on internal controls and other things, and then do some good for the mission, and then just simply let those contracts expire or don't utilize those contracts, later in the process. So we have some built-in flexibilities.
Right. Well, it's good to hear, and hopefully we'll be able to work together to make sure that you don't face a similar shortfall in the future.
Thank you very much.
Yep. I will yield now to my colleague, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa. Sir, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for your indulgence with the other committee's markup. I'm going to start with a question that you wouldn't expect, probably. Mr. McDonald, would you be aware if anyone at EPA currently worked for the CIA and was undercover at your agency?
I think because of things that happened about a decade ago, there was a time it seemed like we were looking for nothing else. I would be surprised at this point if there were.
Well, I don't want you to be surprised, so I would say that in each of your agencies, knowing, since the agency head must be informed by statute of anyone who's embedded, I would ask each of you to go and find out whether erroneously, as happened a decade ago, they believe somebody's with the CIA when in fact they are not. And I only say that because fool me once, he went to jail, but he's out now, and I would really appreciate that question not going by the wayside, because it's as esoteric as it is, it really happened, as you know. On another note, Dr. Lerner, you're aware of an NSF award of about $130,000 in 2022 to the University of Virginia to conduct climate change research with a Beijing-based company in Tsinghua University?
That's not ringing a bell off the top of my head, but I can certainly learn more and get back to you.
I'd appreciate it, since hopefully during the 2 years I left Congress, we stopped providing aid at the Trade Development Agency to China as a developing nation, and hopefully we now are at a position where any funds which are directed toward research in China would be scrutinized for whether they're absolutely necessary. Along that line, are you familiar with programs known as WISE-DEC?
I've just recently become aware of them.
And you're aware that its job is funding the fight against misinformation?
That's what the articles I read indicated.
And are you currently exploring that?
I am happy, our office, because of the focus of our work, we don't have the scientific expertise to assess scientific determinations NSF makes, but we have a history of looking at situations like this to see if appropriate processes were followed in making the award, and if any other concerns exist.
So notwithstanding that figuring out what misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation are, since those are evolving terms, as you know, it's not about the science. The question that I would have for the IG is, on what basis did Congress allow for, particularly the second one, which is this program, and I'll just read it to you, strategically corrects misinformation described by the NSF. Now, as it's defined or described, that's in the eye of the beholder. So the criteria for how they determine misinformation would seem to be within the expertise of your agency.
We will certainly look at that situation.
And then one of the questions is, for each of the panelists, are you currently involved in an investigation or any investigations as to whether the agencies you oversee are in fact suppressing speech or in any way interfacing that would cause the promotion of or the reduction of certain information being available to the public?
As I mentioned earlier, we have an administrative investigations directorate that deals with subjects like this, with censorship and suppression. And while I won't speak on any particular investigation, I can assure you their docket is quite full.
I'm not aware of any investigation work in this area, and it doesn't have an obvious link in my mind to the work of the Department of Transportation.
Yes, we do have a volume of retaliation cases, year in and year out, whistleblower retaliation cases. I don't have anything in the portfolio that suggests a link back to, the most senior leadership.
Okay, and
Or at a
Dr.
lower
Lerner, of course, you do have them, and we'll be looking at them.
We don't at NASA. In fact, we have more websites at NASA pushing on information than any other government agency.
Okay, and then in closing, hopefully, something I heard on CNBC not long ago after people became aware that Hunter Biden's laptop was real and not misinformation or disinformation as it was originally marketed by our government to be. I heard them say, science is never settled. And hopefully, as your agencies explore science, they will take the same attitude that you should never eliminate somebody's contradictory view on any basis. Well, in fact, science is never settled. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Issa. That concludes our member questions. I want to thank all of our panelists for bearing with us and for being so engaged in the discussion. I think you can judge by the amount of interest that we had from our members and the number of quality questions that we got, how interesting a topic we all found this to be. So I thank you very much. We'll have to do this again in the future. The record will remain open for an additional 10 days for comments or written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned.